I rise today to thank Pennsylvania's first responders. I want to thank them for their service at the demonstration sparked by the tragic death of Mr. George Floyd. On behalf of a grateful Commonwealth, I want to thank the local police officers, the Philadelphia Police Department, the Pittsburgh Police Department, Harrisburg Police Department, the Pennsylvania State Police Troopers, firefighters, EMS personnel, the Pennsylvania National Guard, and other first responders who have been protecting our citizens and their communities during the recent demonstrations. Mr. Speaker, long before I served as a Pennsylvania State Representative, I spent 25 years as a Pennsylvania State Trooper. When I speak about issues related to law enforcement, I speak from experience. As a former member of law enforcement, I want to begin by saying there is no excuse for what happened to George Floyd. I believe those involved in his death should face the full consequences of the American justice system. And I respect and support the right of the peaceful demonstrators to protest this tragedy. In fact, out of this tragic death of George Floyd, I've already have seen a few sparks of light in the darkness. Most of us have seen pictures of law enforcement officers kneeling with protesters in a sign of solidarity and support. We also have seen photos of protesters forming human shields to protect police officers who were separated from their colleagues. In the midst of this tragedy, we have seen glimpses of progress. Part of the reason I stand today, Mr. Speaker, is to add my own voice to those calling for more progress. With that in mind, Mr. Speaker, as a former law enforcement officer, I feel it's important for me to share a simple, straightforward message. And that message is this: everyone matters, period. George Floyd's life mattered. The voices of the protesters mattered. And speaking only for myself, I can say I'm listening to them and I've heard them. I can assure you some of the strongest supporters of peaceful protests are law enforcement officers. We know that in countries where people cannot speak peacefully through protests, they often resort to communication through violence. I firmly believe any path out of division currently plaguing our country will begin with honest and open conversations. And conversations only work if we take the time to stop speaking and start listening. We must also avoid the knee-jerk reactions to assume the worst of people who have opinions that are different from our own. We have to be willing to consider the view from inside the other person's shoes. I personally plan to continue to listen to the different voices involved in this important conversation. I believe it's also important simply to acknowledge we hear one another. For example, some of my colleagues on the other side of the aisle have introduced legislation to reform policing procedures. Mr. Speaker, one of the honors that I have as a state legislator is sitting on the board of the Municipal Police Officers Education and Training Commission, known as MOPEC. For those who may be unfamiliar, MOPEC provides support, regulation, and guidance for local police training. I think it's important to note that some of the ideas proposed by my colleagues have already been implemented by MOPEC in their 21st century police training, which began several years ago. MOPEC is ahead of the curve. That is to say, your voices are being heard and change is taking place. Sometimes the really important changes take place at organizations like MOPEC. Those changes, unfortunately, don't always capture headlines or make the evening news. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I just want to reiterate my gratitude for the first responders serving in the front lines at these demonstrations. They help make peaceful protests possible in our Commonwealth, and they actually protect the protesters. I also again want to thank the people who have remained peaceful while participating in the demonstrations. My colleagues have heard me argue in the past that we cannot condemn all law enforcement officers based on bad behavior of a limited number of overzealous police officers. By the same measure, we should not judge the peaceful protesters based on the looting and vandalism of a limited number of criminals. We have seen by far the large majority of protesters simply want to be heard. At the end of the day, law enforcement officers, first responders, and protesters want many of the same things. They want to be able to take care of and provide for their families. They want to be able to make their positive difference in the community, and when the day is done, they want to return safely to their home, to their loved ones. Mr. Speaker, I think we all can get behind the idea of working to ensure more Pennsylvanians return home safely to their families each night. I look forward to continuing to listen to my colleagues, the people they represent, and the peaceful demonstrators. I thank the first responders serving on the front lines of the demonstrations, and I thank my colleagues for their attention to this very important issue. Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and congratulations on your retirement.